Hello, and welcome to yet another edition of the Kandy Fontaine Show. I'm Alex S. Johnson, aka Kandy Fontaine, goddess, and I'm an editor, author, fine artist, poet. I was called the Baudelaire of our time by none other than John Shirley, the primary screenwriter of the cult classic horror film The Crow in 1994, starring Brandon Lee, of course. I've been published alongside people like Patrick Califia, who I've exchanged birthday cards with last year. Patrick Califia is, of course, the author of such classics as Macho Sluts and Charles Bukowski. You may have heard of Charles Bukowski, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, and our authors with Nocturnicorn Books include none other than Poppy Z. Bright, Billy Martin is a regular contributor. Caitlin R. Kiernan is two-time World Fantasy and Bram Stoker Award-winning author of such classics as Silk. And many of our contributors are queer AF. We are One of our forthcoming projects is Riot Pink, a queer reader and resource guide, and I will be including a transcript of this interview with none other than Joshua Grinnell, aka I can't believe this is happening. I'm really, really excited about this. Peaches Christ. Okay, Peaches Christ is an iconic persona, a drag persona, and I would say an icon that Joshua Peaches is an icon of queer cinema, and I don't say that lightly. And I'm going to give you some reasons for my, you know, what may seem like a hyperbolic introduction. So um, Joshua was born in, okay, and you correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, so
Uh-huh.
born in Maryland,
Born in Washington, D.C.,
born in
but did
Washington.
grow up in Maryland.
Okay, so born in Washington, grew up in Maryland, later moved to San Francisco, where he attended San Francisco State University.
No.
No, you did not. Okay,
I went to Penn State
you went to
University
Penn
on the East
State
Coast,
University.
and then right when I graduated, I was like a week later, I got a one-way plane ticket to San Francisco. So I arrived a college graduate.
Oh, nice.
And that was 30 years ago this upcoming May. So I'm
30
celebrating 30
years.
years in 2026.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
While studying film, so you studied film at Penn State or Penn?
Yes.
Okay. My mom went to UPenn or whatever you call it.
Well, she went to the smart one. So there's
Okay.
University of Pennsylvania,
Yeah,
which is Ivy League,
yeah,
and then there's Penn State, which
right,
honestly, it's a good school. I'm really
right.
proud to be a
Yeah,
graduate from there. But I always thought I would go to NYU,
right.
from Maryland, and then I could not afford NYU. It was so outrageously expensive, and
Wow.
there weren't many film schools on the East Coast. And
Wow.
I'm lucky that I was one of the last classes, maybe the last class to shoot on film, to edit on flatbeds, to actually learn how to use an Avid. We were sort of bridging the gap between film and the new technology that was coming in. So
Right.
my senior thesis film, Jizz Mopper,
Dismopper,
was
yeah.
was shot on Super 16 millimeter, and that was the movie that gave life to Peaches. I'd never done full drag before until I was a drag queen in the movie Jizz Mopper.
That's incredible. Is it available in any form or?
Yeah, I mean, we have it on my Patreon.
Okay,
So if
okay.
you subscribe to the Peaches Christ Productions Patreon and you support me, you can sit and watch Jizz Mopper if you so
Hey,
choose to spend 30 minutes of your life doing that. The film should have been about 12 to 15 minutes long, but it's
okay.
30 minutes long.
30 minutes long. Nice. Shades of, Deborah, right?
Hmm.
Was it Deborah Denise?
Yes,
That's a
Deborah Tennis.
Deborah
Deb
Dennis,
Tennis, really. She starts as Deb Tennis,
Deb
and
Tennis.
as she
Oh
as
my
she,
God.
feels her oats, she becomes
Yeah.
Deborah Tenise.
That is one of I mean, it has so much resonance, right? It has like everything from, Elsa Lanchester in Bride of Frankenstein to, of course, you gotta give props to Tim Curry. Um,
Oh, I'm
uh,
glad that you recognize the Tim Curry in it.
yeah,
Very few people do because Natasha Lyonne and I really did map out a blueprint as two movie lovers. Me and
yeah,
Natasha love movies.
yeah,
Of here's a girl who grew up in a movie theater, a mousy librarian who read
right,
books and watched old movies. And
yeah,
how do you mash up her love of literature with her love of movies? And so we as she became more bloodthirsty, she became more iconic. So there are
yeah,
scenes where she's doing Katharine Hepburn. There's scenes where she's doing Mae West. There's
right.
scenes where she's doing Betty Davis.
I saw
People
that. Yeah,
clock those, a
right.
little bit
Yeah,
more, but they rarely clock that on the roof of the cinema for the finale. Spoiler alert, it does end on a roof. It's all very cliched.
yeah.
She is doing Tim Curry.
Yeah, that I mean, there's so many things, and we'll get into it because, for example, as a huge admirer of people like Lamberto Bava and
Yeah.
Dario Argento, right? And also Michele Soavi, right?
hmm
And I think there was a like a stage fright, some stage fright references. Aquarius, I could be wrong, right?
Well, not so much, but I will
Okay.
say this,
Yeah.
Candy. I will tell you that I think I know where all my references come from.
Hmm.
And I will be sitting watching a movie I haven't seen for 40, 50 years. No, not 50. I'm only
Right.
51. But, a long time ago. And I will see something in that movie that I know I watched in the 80s. And I'll go, oh my God, that's
Uh,
where that came from.
right.
So sometimes you're not even clear about your own
Yeah.
references. Others of them, especially in All About Evil, are really on the nose.
Right.
Herschel
Yeah.
Gordon Lewis was a big influence, and
Right.
then for the character herself, I was very inspired by a filmmaker called Doris Wishman, and so I was really looking at old grindhouse movies, and then yeah, when I made it. But the references are all over the place. Like the movie Popcorn from the 80s, the
Yes.
movie Demons, um,
Demons.
very, very influential.
Right.
Of course, Female Trouble, Serial Mom,
Right.
hugely influential. So, there's the ones that I'm very aware of. Phantom of the Paradise actually was a reference. But it's a movie about movies, so there's probably 1,000 references to movies in that one film.
Yeah. I'm gonna sort of nip and tuck in a kind of a couple of, Russian doll infolded references, which I think you'll appreciate. Okay, one of
Well,
my
Russian Doll's very appropriate
Russian
considering the
doll, yeah.
star of the film. Yeah.
Yes, Russian doll is very appropriate indeed, right? And so one of my good friends from, goes back, way, way back to the LA days is Leslie Spivey, aka Ivorian von Spivey from the, death rock supergroup Penis Flytrap. I'm sure you're familiar with them, right?
I am familiar. Yes.
Yes. And she, one of her claims to fame, were actually, I was going to be writing a book with her. I don't know, it may be a series of articles called Cemetery Girls, because I also interviewed, Dinah Cancer from 45 Grave and all these amazing women, right?
Yeah.
So I was thinking so anyway, one of her claims to fame is that she was not only just close friends with, but like lived with Ken Anger, for
Mhm.
like 25 years. And they had a kind of a very, very strange kind of three-way relationship with Bobby Beausoleil from, better known as, one of the Manson family murderers, right?
Of
You can't
course.
make this stuff up. And I'm sure that
Yeah.
John Waters would be delighted. And as a matter of fact, Ken Anger was, like one of the biggest influences on people like Martin Scorsese, John Waters, even the late great David Lynch, right? And the reason I'm bringing this up, I'm sure there's a reason. What is it, Kandy? Yes, Cecil B. Demented. I
Uh-huh.
mean, the Natasha Lyonne character is one of the things she does. She does that sort of like that thing, and I just thought the whole idea of kind of having a almost like a they have a film director who was fucking insane, right? Um, and sort of invoking all of these icons of transgressive cinema, right?
hmm
I very, very much, I believe that I spotted a little, Cecil B. Demented Easter egg.
I'm sure. You know,
Yeah.
that's the thing. I mean, John Water, I grew up in Maryland
Oh, wow.
and
Yeah, that's right.
discovering John Waters at a young age because when growing up in Maryland, you don't feel like there's anything close to Hollywood nearby. LA
Mhm.
feels like it's a million miles away. I was a
Yeah,
kid who was obsessed with horror movies, obsessed with Elvira,
right.
subscribed to Fangoria magazine. And then when I was about, 12 years old, 13 years
Yeah,
old, the local news starts reporting on, I mean, I wasn't interested in Barry Levinson, but
right.
they start reporting on this guy making a movie in my fucking like aunt's neighborhood. You know
Nice.
what I mean? Like
Yeah,
I grew up outside of Baltimore in Annapolis, and the movie's called Hairspray, and
right.
the loving mother in the movie is played by this person named Divine, who's now on the local news.
Right.
And I was a kid who had to, when you're so queer as a kid, you
Yeah.
pretend almost not to be interested in things that are going to give you away. So I remember
Right.
secretly, like, looking for John Waters movies at
Yeah,
the video store. And of course, it's the 80s and I'm Gen X. So, like, no, there was no parental controls at all. Like you could rent whatever you want. I rented Caligula,
oh,
at the age
nice.
of 10 or whatever.
Yeah,
Um, because we just took the movies home and watched them in the basement, and our parents never knew what we were watching. So I got to see Multiple Maniacs and Pink Flamingos at an extremely impressionable age,
nice.
and I can't underestimate the impact that John Waters has had on my whole life. Reading his book Shock Value was as important as any film school because Shock Value introduced me to Herschel Gordon Lewis and Ted V. Michaels and Russ Meyer and,
Right, right, right.
John's, obsessions.
Yes,
So John Waters is the most influential. The thing with me though is I never wanted to be John and I never wanted to be divine because they are so sacred and I
yeah, of
worship
course.
them
Yeah,
so much that
yeah,
it would almost seem like in my view blasphemy to attempt to be them. That's why I hate when people describe their own work as being like John Waters. I want to be
yeah.
like, go fuck yourself. There
Right?
is no one else like
There is no
John
one else
Waters.
like
There's
John
only
Lennon.
one,
Right.
and there
Yeah.
can only be one divine.
Yes.
But obviously, the two of them and everything they did, Mink Stoll, all of them, Edith
Yeah.
Massey, massively, massively influential on me and very much set me on a path. And it was actually John Waters, who I met in college when I was making Jizmopper. I brought him to Penn
Wow.
State. And it was John who said, you should check out San Francisco because I had asked about, whether I should move to New York or LA. And
Yeah.
it was John who said, that he and Mink and Divine used to go to San Francisco and hang out with this group called the Cockettes. And of course, this was before there was a documentary about the Cockettes,
Oh, wow.
So he told me the Cockettes were this renegade, hippie, drag troupe of commune living freaks with
Fucking love it.
glitter bearded performers
Yeah.
who did shows at the Palace Theater before midnight movie screenings. And a lot of people don't realize that that seed is what became Midnight Mass.
Yeah.
That was my obsession. Like, what do you mean there were drag queens who screened movies and did
Right.
shows before movies?
Yeah.
And John is the real reason I moved to San Francisco, along with MTV's The Real World had just
Yeah.
done a season here, and Armistead Maupin's Tales of the City had
Yes.
just played on PBS. And
Yeah.
those things combined are what drew me to this magical place, thinking I'd only be here for a few years.
Right.
And then I would go to New York or LA. But of
Yeah.
course, the rest is history.
The rest is
I fell
history.
in love with San Francisco and I planted roots here, and I still work with many of the creative collaborators I met here in the mid 90s.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. So we've talked a little bit about the seeds, as it were, of the
Yeah.
your fantastic creation, Peaches Christ. It's really I love your performance of Smells Like, queer spirit. Right?
Smells like Queen Spirit.
Queen
Yes.
Spirit,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
Queen Spirit, yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you. We did an evening of gay grunge recently.
Gay grunge, nice.
Yeah.
So, I've found, and this is true. This is something I've discussed with people like Elvorian, you know, that a lot of people who are kind of in our wheelhouse as you know kind of dripping with spunk and gore and what have you, dismembered body parts and tits.
Yeah.
Um, is that, we're not all, I mean, some of us are very introverted. Like I'm a very shy person, but
Hmm.
I was born in Halloween, and I kind of think it
Oh,
was
amazing.
a bit of destiny, right?
Yeah.
Because I've always felt this strong affinity. I didn't know what it was, but towards these characters. Like, I just recently realized, and I was discussing this with my good friend Nicole Six, is that shout out to Nicole, right? Is that we're writing a film together. It's called Serial Date, and it's going to be intensely in your face queer horror. It's queer as fuck. So, but that I recently saw the movie Basic Instinct 2, which I'd never seen before.
Oh,
And
yeah, it's wild.
it's wild, and I realized that that character is not only it's Candy Fontaine, but it's me, and
Uh-huh.
it's very anomalous because I am a shy person, and I don't know about you, but did you feel, and this is something I also discussed with my friend Tony Zanetta, who was the president of Main Man Entertainment and the road manager for Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, is
Mm.
that, like, he said that, that David Bowie was kind of he was he wasn't terribly exciting as a performer. And he put on Ziggy, and all of a sudden it's like, well, Ziggy played guitar, it was wild. And he and Angie Bowie really, shaped that persona. And they wanted, David wanted to be a pop star. He said when he was 7 years old, Mommy, I want to be a pop star. Now, what was it like for you? When did you get this sense that you had to be, you incarnated as this larger than life, persona?
That's a, question that I've actually had to ask my parents because I don't remember not being like this,
Yeah.
so very much if you knew me as a child or you knew me as a teenager or a young adult and you see what I'm doing today, you would go, "Oh yeah, that person has not changed very much."
Right. Right.
All my same obsessions, all my childhood obsessions
Yeah.
and interests and passions have pretty much been the same. Of course, they evolve and you get introduced to new things, but if as far as being into spooky, scary horror stuff, anything transgressive or queer or weird or alternative. Um, I've always been this way. My parents sort of say, like, yeah, for as long as we can remember. And it was just, always part of you. I will say that your um, statement about yourself actually resonates with me as well, which is that in a lot of situations, I'm either on or I'm off, meaning my default is really to actually be more of an introvert and to be more of an observer. And
Yeah.
if I don't show up places and feel the need to always be the entertainer, like I'm not always motivated by that.
Sure.
But the drag and the character and performing, or even before being Peaches Christ, just performing in general, putting on costumes, being a character, taking on another identity, was always a really exciting and fun thing for me. And it always unlocked a different channel of creativity. So much so that I taught a class about it at the San Francisco Art Institute, rest in peace. Um, I ended up creating a class for them called Creating Character, where all the students had to come in. I taught them about David Bowie and Ziggy Stardust. We looked at Cassandra Peterson as Elvira. We
Yeah.
looked at Cindy Sherman as a photographer who created a different character of herself to photograph. And we looked at these artists and really talked about how they may not have been able to do it without the armor of this drag or costume or
Mhm.
persona or alternative identity. And then each student had to create their own alt character. And then
Yeah.
for the rest of the semester, there was a point where they had to come to class as their character, and then they had to start creating work as their character
That's
for
also
their
so
character.
much
It was
fun.
great.
Oh my
Yeah.
God, that's so much fun. So were there prototypes of I was about to say Candy Fontaine, but Candy Fontaine was actually a character I created it more than a decade ago, and it's actually I also discovered that it's a line of plushies. It's called, with a C, is as in, candy, that you eat. Um, but it is also called Candy Fontaine. And so were there trial runs?
That's a good question. Not really. I
Okay.
was always I sometimes think of myself as uh a kid who was probably non-binary that didn't have the word non-binary.
Yeah.
And so if you look at me before I discovered that I could be Peaches Christ,
Yeah. Right.
I was very like my femme side was very much part of my outward expression, meaning I was going to class in college, with barrettes in my hair. Sometimes
Nice.
I'd wear lipstick,
Nice.
I also enjoyed being provocative, and I was
Right.
definitely a queer activist. And
Yeah.
so I think expressing an alt gender, identity was already something I was playing with. But because I was introduced to drag through, well, Elvira, which I realized later that it was drag, but really through Divine and Frankenfurter,
Yeah.
my identity around drag was so synonymous with cult cinema that when
Right.
I was making Jizz Mopper, I knew that Peaches needed to be this expression of myself. I
Yeah.
understood enough about drag and the transgressive nature of drag that I kind of had an idea already of what I wanted Peaches to be. So when I made the movie and then I promoted the movie in Central Pennsylvania in 1995, 96 in
Yeah.
drag, it was dangerous. We were bashed, literally,
I'm so
physically beat
sorry.
up. You,
I'm so
you know,
sorry.
I look at it this way. It
Reasons.
was worth it.
Okay. Okay. I
And
love
we
that.
were pissed and we were punk and we fought back and we
Fucking
would
love it.
stage,
Yeah.
direct actions and find those people. I made a documentary called Penn State Black and Blue
Nice.
about that time that was about gays at Penn State being bashed. Um, so I was very much into all of that, the activism, the art, the
Yes.
midnight movies of it.
Yeah.
But when I got to San Francisco in 1996, that's really when Peaches Christ was born. And it was
Yeah.
like I hit the ground running and
Yeah.
I was performing at the most outrageous stage in the city, which was Tranny Shack. It had just started at the
Granny
Stud. And
check. Yes.
yeah, and it was a weekly punk rock drag showcase that was, oh my God, it was wild. It was insane. And it's where I met so many of my favorite collaborators. And then 2 years later, I started Midnight Mass, which Midnight Mass was really basically an offshoot of Tranny Shack. And then the two events, had a lot of overlap because Heclina ran Tranny Shack and I ran Midnight Mass. And I would go in and run her club for her, and she was a
Yeah.
regular performer at Midnight Mass. And so the two things kind of built together. And they very much had a spirit of anarchy and, drag that was intentionally button pushing and
Right.
provocative and also very fun,
Of
and
course.
funny.
Of
That
course.
was the other thing. Like, we didn't
Yeah.
want to necessarily upset people. We,
Right.
we, we, we were okay with upsetting certain people,
Yeah.
but not our own community. We were
Yeah.
creating entertainment for people.
That is as you're speaking, Joshua, I was just sort of thinking of a number of different things. For example, how much of an overlap there is between, like, queer identity and punk rock and the origins of punk rock. One of my friends who I've also collaborated with is none other than Carrie Lee Chrome, or Carrie Lee Mitchell, who founded a little band called The Runaways, right? Back in
Amazing.
1975 or 76, right? And just the prospect of, like, she said, "Hey, do you want to write some stuff together?" And I was like, "Well, I think I asked her, can you teach me how to write songs?" She's like, "Sure," right? So we wrote a whole bunch of stuff together, and it's never been released. But I think she's like a really fabulously funny person, and she could be
Hmm.
a great stand-up comedian. She's obsessed. She calls herself, like, she says, "Alex, I'm a like a 12-year-old boy. I'm obsessed with like fart jokes and, you know, and
Me
she,
too.
she really is, very juvenile
Yes,
person,
I'm the same. I'm very
right?
immature.
Very immature, but wonderful, Mad Magazine, all this shit. So Carrie, what was the whole point? Oh yeah, so she is, obviously a queer pioneer, and Bowie and Lou Reed and Iggy Pop and all those people were massive influences on her work, as well as, like the Ronettes and Screamin' Jay Hawkins, and a lot of R&B stuff. She's really into R&B stuff too, as well. But it's not so much of a question. It's just I'm trying to formulate an idea. So you had Bowie, right? You had people like Dinah Cancer, 45 Grave. You had Roz Williams, the late great Roz Williams. I had the pleasure of, interviewing back in the day. I actually
Oh,
interviewed,
icon. I mean, that's
right?
someone who, yeah. I mean, all those people, I mean, especially for Heklina and myself and a lot of the
Yeah,
performers back in the mid 90s
right.
who were doing this sort of alt drag. It's like
Yeah.
our icons were people like Susie Sue, Roz Williams,
Yes.
David Bowie,
Bowie.
certainly.
Yes.
Heklina was obsessed with Bjork, people who were
Yeah.
really making, I mean, Grace Jones, like
Right.
it
Right.
was
Right.
like we were attracted. I mean, we're lucky. I feel like Gen X, in many ways, we're so lucky when I think about the amount of exciting music and
Right.
pop culture and gender expression that,
Gender. Yeah.
the gender expression of the 80s is kind of insane when you look at
Yeah.
people like, Annie Lennox, becoming a massive, massive pop star,
True. Yeah.
wearing a very butch, masculine presenting guise. And no one questioned Prince or even the heavy metal bands at the time.
Exactly.
No one questioned Poison. I mean, they were
Poison.
giving trans, like it
Right.
wasn't like, yes, you had Twisted Sister and, there was sort of camp drag heavy metal. But then there was like the hair metal bands that were like literally doing full on beats, a beautiful face makeup.
Yeah.
And then the 90s, it got less interesting. And then by the 2000s, my God, it got
Yeah.
so boring.
Right. Yeah.
It's like we really were in this. I mean, Roz Williams, Susie Sue. I mean, it's
Exactly.
like,
Oh my God.
where did
Yeah.
they come from? Yeah.
Yeah. And also
Steve Strange.
it
Sorry.
was
Now you've got me on
right.
oh
Yeah.
my God. It was
Oh
a
my
Gary
God. Right.
Newman. I mean, it was just
Exactly.
so
Gary Newman.
amazing.
It's
Yeah.
incredible. And so that was a phoner, right? That was with Roz, but I actually got to sit down with Gatan Damon
Wow.
in person. And you know who else I talked to? This is a really beautiful thing because I kind of like some people collect, baseball cards or whatever. I collect memories of, squeezy hugs. So, and this is, something we're gonna, you know, gonna do at the end of this, whatever interview. But I've had squeezy hugs from like Terry B. Murphy, I had like and Jeton Damone and I got a peck on the cheek from Caroline Monroe of all
Mm.
people. I had tea with Caroline
You
Monroe.
you are you're quite you seem to have met everyone.
Now I've met you. Now I've met everybody, right? I never met John Waters. I never met William S. Burroughs, but you know, um, yeah, so I guess I'm not going to formulate a question. I'm just expressing my exuberance. And I think one of the things I really admire about All About Evil, and I mean, obviously what's interesting is that you expect that's kind of like a red herring because you expect that it's going to be like, like the Betty Davis vehicle, but the Betty Davis reference is actually Natasha Lyonne, you know, as opposed to there's no was it Ann Baxter, right? Ann Baxter plays the ingenue who's
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it really has nothing to do with All About Eve
exactly.
and other than the truth is the movie is based on a short film called Grindhouse,
Oh wow.
and that short film was made in 2003. And I made that film and I screened it at my own. I had to make up my own film festival
Yeah.
because no film festivals would screen my film. So I created something called the San Francisco Underground Short Film Festival, which is happening tonight. I mean, I'm
Nice.
I'm not a part of it anymore. I
Yeah.
gladly hand over the reins after 20 years,
Yeah.
but I'm excited to attend it tonight because it's this thing I created back in, the year 2000 or something with
Yeah.
my friend Vin Santos. Vin
Nice.
Santos, who's produced by David J. See,
Nice.
this is all a full circle moment.
It is.
Anyway, Grindhouse was what the movie was going to be called. And when the producer, Darren Stein, who wrote and directed Jawbreaker,
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
Darren and I sent it to Rose McGowan to see if she
Nice.
had any interest. And Darren called me and he says, Joshua, I have terrible news. I'm like, oh no, Rose didn't like the script. He goes, no, she loved the script, but she can't do it because she's already going to be starring in this big over the top gore comedy. I said, oh God. And he goes, oh no, that's not the bad news. I'm like, well, what's the bad news? He's like, well, it's being directed by Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez. And I'm like, oh no, we
No.
can't compete. And he goes, well, the bad news is it's called Grindhouse.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh no. So the next title that it
Yeah.
had was after I did a show with Herschel Gordon Lewis. And I
Nice.
told Herschel Gordon Lewis, who I was so intimidated to meet. He was the loveliest, sweetest, kindest guy. I don't know why I thought maybe he'd be surly and cranky. I think because I had a sort of a negative run in the one time I ever talked to Russ Meyer was
Oh,
not
wow.
pleasant,
Wow.
and here was this man that I admired so much who was
Yeah.
kind of screaming at me on the phone. you know, um, I was kind of going, oh no, like is Herschel Gordon Lewis going to be mean to me? And he was the sweetest man. And I said, I wrote a screenplay that is inspired by you and your movies. And he's very self-deprecating, like, oh no, why would you do that? That kind of thing. And I told him the plot of the screenplay, and then I told him how it couldn't be called Grindhouse,
Yeah.
and that I was looking for a new title. And he said, "Hey, you should call it by the name of my old gore cinema in Florida." He had a movie theater that he owned with his film. I forget the guy's name, the guy he made all the movies with,
Yeah.
and that movie theater was called The Bloodshed.
The
And I was
bloodshed.
like, that's amazing. And at the time, I was still performing at something called Tranny Shack. So I'm like,
Yeah.
wow, the Bloodshed. That's what it'll be called. So I name it that. It gets on IMDb. And then this person who I adore, a filmmaker named Alan Rowe Kelly, who is an underground horror filmmaker, very successful in the underground indie horror world. And Alan Rowe Kelly presents as a female and goes by male
Nice.
pronouns and the
Wow.
name
Wow.
Alan. Even though if you see Alan, you're going to want to say she
Right.
because he is gorgeous and
Beautiful.
classic in
I love that.
Hollywood. And
Yeah.
Alan calls me the only other trans horror filmmaker I know, right?
Yeah. Right.
Now there's more of them, but this is back in the early 2000s. And
Yeah.
Alan says, girl, what is this movie on your IMDb page? I said, it's called The Bloodshed. Blah, blah.
Oh my
And
gosh.
Alan goes, my upcoming movie is called The Bloodshed. And I'm like, no.
No.
So then I thought, well, what would Deborah call her movie?
Yeah.
And of course, Deborah was making movies like A Tale of Two Severed Titties and,
Seriously.
silly movies. I said, oh, it's
Yeah.
a movie about movies. Let's just call it All About Evil. And that's why it was called that, because it's
Yeah.
what the character might call the movie.
Yeah. That's incredible. And that was okay. And a couple of other, thoughts. First of all, the practical effects. Like you obviously love those old school, practical effects. I mean,
Hmm.
I don't see any traces of, CGI, and there may be, but to my eyes, there was not really, and also process shots.
Yep. So that I will tell you, I worked with
Yeah,
a really great director of photography, which was one of the things I really wanted as a first time feature filmmaker,
yeah,
to work with a seasoned pro. And I also worked with people who had done practical effects.
yeah,
And the producers were very clear with me when they read the script that it was going to have to be CGI. And
yeah,
I really was like, no. And they said, for the amount of money we have, the movie was made for under $1 million. just about $1 million. They said, these practical effects are insane. Now, I had to rewrite the script. So the script, the movie that you saw
Oh,
was the one that satisfied the producers.
okay.
The original, had stuff in it that got cut, because I had to make it affordable. For example, there was a whole rat storyline, and the only way they were going to allow me to do the rats was that they were going to be CGI, and there was a king rat that sat on Mr. Twiggs's shoulder,
Nice.
and so the whole movie theater was infested with rats. And when Mink Stole was dying in the attic, she ripped through the stitches that were, keeping her mouth sewn shut, which
Yeah.
was in the movie. But instead of her being decapitated by Mr. Twiggs, the death was all the rats in the attic coming and
Nice.
eating her face,
I love it.
alive.
Yeah.
And yeah, so
As one
basically
does, right?
they call it killing your babies. That's
Oh,
the
yeah.
expression. So I had to go in, rewrite the script, and kill a
Yeah.
bunch of babies in order to keep CGI out of the
Yes.
movie. So I'm glad that you appreciated it because I prefer, even if it looks cheesy, even
Yeah.
if it looks fake, to me, it's more effective storytelling
Right.
if the blood is squirting onto the actor. If the puppet or the body falls and
Yes.
lands on the actor's head. The
Right.
twins at the end, spoiler alert, the twins, they really
Yeah.
go after each other.
Yeah.
That was practical. Now, what was CGI'd there was the slight little uh, line in those blades where the blade was retracting. So that's the kind of CGI I
Ooh.
allowed for, where they
Okay.
went in and erased the line on the knife that gave away that it was a retractable
Right.
blade. But those two twins,
Yeah.
when they're jamming those knives into each other,
Yeah.
they were really doing that. Like,
Holy
we had
shit.
to put these sort of metallic metal corsets on them so
Yeah.
they could really. And I think because they were sisters in real life, there was this sort of comfort of really going for it.
Yeah.
So I love practical effects. I think, you know, I mean, I grew up I keep referencing the 80s, but, to me, I would rather watch puppets in the Star Wars movies than these computer renditions of
Yeah.
Yoda. I'd much rather watch a Jim Henson
Me
puppet
too.
than
Me too.
something that looks more natural or more real that's computer generated.
Yeah.
I don't find it more realistic. I find the puppet talking to Mark Hamill to be more effective than the computer. So
Agreed.
that's just, yeah, that's the school I come from. So I'm glad that
Yeah.
you appreciated that part of it because I did have to fight for it.
Very, very much so. And I'm thinking of directors like Lucio Fulci, and of
Hmm.
course, you got to have some Lucio, and and in referencing going back to Lamberto Bava and Damoni and so forth, where you have that, those practical effects and those whatever applications, whatever you call it, um, although they don't look realistic. Somehow
Hmm.
there's something for me that's more heartwarming, when you see even somebody like Andreas Schnoss, the micro budget, gore director of films like, he did a remake of Anthropophagus and the Grim Reaper, which is essentially the same film, but with more gore shit.
Uh-huh.
And I love that. I love, if it's heartfelt, to me, that's meaningful. And
Hmm.
so another thing about All About Evil is that it's a cult classic, it's a true cult classic, insofar as I would put it up right up there with Meet the Feebles, which to me is a high bar, right?
Well, that's really flattering. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I really mean it. And because it's made with tender care. There's no, you're not trying to be edgy. You're not trying to be like, oh, you're not trying to make a cult classic. You made a cult classic because you went to the source code, right? Like these are all the references, all the Easter eggs are to things that I mean, probably part of your DNA, not just as a creator, but kind of as a person, right? That strike a chord in your soul when you see, Rocky for the first time, you see
Hmm.
Betty Davis for the first time, or you even see, oh, remember those movies, because we're probably about the same age, when those back in the 70s, when you would go to see a Disney film, and children's films were not this, or young, even young adult films were not the same as they are now. I mean, there was real child endangerment in those
Yeah,
movies, like Escape from Witch Mountain with
they were terrifying.
Lee and holy shit, right? And
Something Wicked This Way
something
Comes, and
wicked,
all those
yeah,
old Disney movies were so scary and so fabulous,
yeah,
and children weren't sort of what's the word, overly protected when it
yeah,
came to
right,
sort of like the villains and things. I mean, even if you look at, I just did a whole Terror Vault show on witches, so I
right.
really dove into old fairy tales, and I'm kind of like, okay, well, in our show the witches need to be eating children. There needs to be a whole cannibal sequence.
There definitely
And
needs to be.
someone said, that's way too dark. I'm like, too dark? That's Hansel and Gretel. What are you talking about? We grew up with this stuff. Whereas now I don't know that, those kinds of things would be made. I think kids would be too precious for it. And parents, what's ironic is, they're so worried about stuff like that. Meanwhile, kids have access to the internet.
They do, and well, I'm not going to talk about uh this romance novelist that I dated briefly, aka Violet Hart, which later I sort of transformed her in my mind into Puce Colon, another, mix and match with, a body, an organ and a color, you know, Violet Heart. This is one of the things that I created or was, collaborated with some other people. This is called Fucked Up Fairy Tales. And so this is very, very raunchy, very the I created this character called Princess Cherry Pop, and this my contribution is the perils of Princess Cherry Pop. Begins the ultimate battle for power when the Baroness of Cunningham tries to gain control of the pussy of power. Will Cherry Pop be able to resist? And
Nice.
thank you. Thank you. And I am also literally the cousin of Andy Warhol superstar Bibi Hansen. So yeah, it's
Wow.
it's weird, right? I was like, this is my destiny. I mean, I was if I was going to be anything, I was going to be, Candy Fontaine because yeah, of course, Bibi was, made some films with none other than Andy Warhol starring, Edie Sedgwick and oh my God, she was friends with Candy Darling and just incredible life. But so witty and clever, Bill Plimpton, right?
Uh-huh.
Right. So we got an
That's
endorsement
great.
from Bill Plimpton himself. Um, so yeah, so I want to talk about more of the kind of so okay, what do you think is so intoxicating, both as a performer and as a fan of drag?
What do I think is intoxicating about drag in general?
Yeah,
I have this theory that a part of its power uh, has been connected to, for many of us, and drag takes on many shapes, right? Like I was lucky that I landed in San Francisco, and because of the Cockettes and generations of drag performers before me,
yeah,
I was part of a community that saw drag as costume and performance, and didn't see it as rigidly as some other communities where it's like, this is a man who dresses as a woman. I grew up around drag kings.
yeah,
I was, always in performance troupes with cis women, people who were AFAB. So drag for me has always been about, an exaggerated costume and performance style. But what I realized over time was that a big part of its power is that it is reclamation.
yeah,
In many ways, when you're watching me on stage as Peaches, you're watching a kid who was shamed for being a sissy embrace this thing that they have always been, which is feminine and
right,
outrageous. But because they were silenced for so long, and because they grew up Catholic, and because they grew up, in a community that wasn't queer affirming, when you watch a drag performance, you're watching something more than just a performance. You're watching a reclamation, you're watching a personal celebration, you're watching someone, really truly express their identity. So it's different than other types of theater or performance. And it's not the same thing as going and watching someone play a drag queen. So if you're watching someone play a drag queen in a show or a movie, and they're not a drag queen, that's not the same thing.
Yeah.
Watching a drag queen, someone like, I always think of my sisters like Coco Peru, and, because a lot of us have talked about this, Heklina,
Yeah.
Varla Jean Merman, we grew up as sissies. We grew
Yeah.
up, really, um, kind of tortured for being the way we were.
Yeah.
So to get to do this now in our life, it's bigger than just, throwing on a wig. There's a spiritual component to it.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I can see that. I mean, there's something to me so glorious, so fucking, and it is literally. I mean, when you look at like, the origin of the name Divine, for example, it's from Jean Genet, right? It's a character in Jean Genet, whose works include. I mean, I think it was from either the our um Miracle of the Flowers. I mean, his characters are sort of reclaim queer identity as spiritual, and they're criminals, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, so when I see, for example, you perform like Smells Like, Queen Spirit, um, there's something, and you can tell that just the feeling in the crowd. I mean, whether you're, cis, whatever, mask or whatever your identity. I mean, these identities are very, very fluid, and I think very up for grabs, We're always changing. And I think that there's something everybody, I don't care who you are, I mean, you could be the most, kind of like locked down, homophobic, like, them queers, you know, I think some of the most queer kind of people that I've known have been the most homophobic as well. I mean, like I had a friend in college who was, he was like a football star and so forth. And he was very, very kind of homophobic, and he was very, you know, would put down my gay friends, whatever. One morning, Joshua, he crawled through my window at 3 a.m. in the morning with and he was like, Alex, and he he had a very peculiar idiom of speech that he learned from listening, to a live REO Speedwagon album over and over and over again. So Kevin Cronin is a very, characteristic, delivery. It was like, Alex, drunk on, in wine. I love you, man. And I was like, dude, you just crawled through my window at 3 a.m. in the morning to say you love me?
Yeah.
Okay, so what are we
I mean,
saying here? You know what I
we
mean?
know for a fact
Fact.
that the most fucked up homophobic people, we know this. Like I mean, look at what is going on in the world right now. It is
Right?
bananas. And been in the last 5 years, this whole, drag became so popular because of things like RuPaul's Drag Race, and it really threatened, the haters because their kids were enjoying this TV
Exactly.
show. And,
Right.
so then all of a sudden it's like, no,
Yeah.
no, no, drag queens are dangerous. They
Yeah.
are groomers. Trans people and drag queens are pedophiles. I mean, this has been the
Yeah.
narrative, right? But the people screaming it the loudest, I will always maintain, go look at their hard drives.
Right.
Look at their hard drives. Go. Because I guarantee you, come and check me out. Come
Right.
and check out all the drag queens.
Right.
And then compare that to the percentage of religious leaders and government conservatives. And you tell me who are the real predators and the
Yeah.
real dangerous. And we all know.
Yeah.
Anyone who knows anything about these statistics,
Yeah.
you can look it up. So when people are screaming about being anti-gay and homophobic, or that drag queens are predators, especially if they're accusing people of being, groomers or predators,
Yeah.
I guarantee you they are hiding something.
I mean, most of my friends are queer, and but or they're beautiful, incredible women and or queer women and whatever. It doesn't matter. I mean, but I've never been, what do they call it, groomed or what do they say about trans people, that trans people are trying to conscript you into their lesbian, whatever,
It's
sex world.
insanity.
But
Like
yeah,
what? It makes no sense, but
right.
whatever.
Um, the only time I've been groomed was by one of my theology teacher at Jesuit High School here in Carmichael, California. Jacob Lane was a pedophile. He was part of a pedophile ring that's operated for the last 40 years at Jesuit. And, his name was Gunter Klingenbrunner. He's now dead. And they probably, you know, hung himself or something, rot in hell, motherfucker.
Yeah.
He was going around like raping my classmates,
Yeah. I had a very
and
similar experience with our Catholic church. The priest that
exactly.
came to my family's home every Christmas with
Yeah.
his mother, you
Wow.
know, um, was, when the whole big first wave of um oh God, when all that went down in Boston and then the entire church was sort of revealed as participating in these
Yeah.
cover-ups, our parishioner, Michael Spillane, who is now out of prison, who had been moved around, was revealed that he was. I remember when my mother called me to give me the news, and I was like pissed that she didn't
Right.
ask me if I had
Yeah.
ever been molested by him, because I'm
Yeah.
like, don't you care? And I said,
Right.
I can't believe you haven't asked me.
Right.
And she
Right.
said,
Right.
well, to be honest, I'm pretty confident you weren't because I never left you alone with him. She said, a mother's intuition can be quite scary sometimes because you don't want
Yeah.
to believe something. She goes, I loved Father Splain. I loved his mother, but there was always something that told me never to leave you kids alone with him. And so you never were alone with him. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. But yeah, talk about grooming. My God, the church, religion, all this shit. We could go on and on.
Exactly. I know you have to go, so there's one last question I had for right now. So there's the character arc of Cassandra Peterson's character is
Mhm.
in All About Evil is really interesting because there's also, some Easter eggs where, what was the name of her son? And
Stephen.
Stephen, right? Her son is a fan of Elvira, of course.
Yeah.
And so, and he says, "Oh, I'm in love with an older woman," and the camera pans to a
Yeah.
poster of Elvira, right? And there was also you put in a little you and Cassandra put in a little kind of Elvira-esque speech, right? And
Yeah.
right, of course. But her character kind of goes from somebody who's just very, anti-horror and it's, oh, I don't like that, to kind of fascinated. And she winds up in line
Yeah.
for the feature, whatever it's called, the what was
Gore
it?
and Peace.
Gore and Peace. Yeah,
It
yeah.
had to be an epic finale. Yeah.
Oh my God, that was brilliant. So I know you have to go. So how do people get in touch with you?
Uh, That's a good question because I am moving back to my own website. I
Okay.
invested in revamping the whole thing because of all this shit with these horrible people who own these companies.
Yeah.
I am on the social media, so you
Right.
can find me, on the different ones. Not
Yeah.
not Twitter anymore. I just
Right.
couldn't stomach that any longer.
Yeah.
But I did move to
Was
my
it the
own. That
Nazis, Joshua? Was it the Nazis? I
It
mean,
was the
for
Nazism, believe
me,
it or
it was
not.
kind
Yeah,
of the
that that
Nazis.
the,
Yeah.
that was enough. And you know what's funny? Actually, it was before that when he took it over in
Yeah.
San Francisco. He locally it was very revealing, what kind of person he was by the way he handled that takeover. And that's when I jumped off of it because of just the stories that were coming out from inside Twitter.
Wow.
And so it was kind of like I think they're just all horrible. And anyway, point is peacheschrist.com because I am not sure how long I'm going to be on those other things. I
Yeah.
mean, every day I'm like, ugh, I don't know if I can keep up with being on, fucking Meta or whatever.
Yeah.
So, I'm still there on some of them, but my most reliable source of information is going to be my own website.
Okay, cool. And what's your what can people expect from you that you can talk about?
As far as stuff that's coming up,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
yeah. Well, I have these symphony shows coming up, which is so weird because I do perform in symphony halls now.
yeah.
And so I'm doing a bunch of holiday ones. And then I'll be doing a new Terror Vault show in
Nice.
2026. We've signed on to do another one. I have a movie that I'm trying to get off the ground about Doris Fish and the making of Vegas in space. So
Mhm.
if you've seen Tim Burton's Ed Wood, it's
Of
kind of
course.
that sort of take on these renegade drag performers who were making a cult movie in the 80s in their
Nice.
apartments in San Francisco and financing the movie through their own sex work. So I really am excited about that. I'm working on that. And then Mink Stoll and I are doing a lot of
Oh,
shows
nice.
together in 2026. So we're going to, let's see if I can rattle them off real quickly. It starts in, oh God, I'm gonna cheat and look because I have it right here. Uh, is it Toronto? No, Rochester, New York. This is the thing. We've been to so many places that
Yeah.
now we're like, let's go to all the places we haven't been, and then some of them we're going back to. So it's Rochester, New York, Toronto, Ontario, Columbus, Ohio, Chicago, Illinois, Madison, Wisconsin, Salt Lake City, Denver, Colorado, London, UK, Manchester, Newcastle, Edinburgh, Dublin, Ireland,
Oh,
Amsterdam, and
fantastic.
Berlin.
Oh,
So we're doing
fantastic.
that in the spring. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I've got friends in many of those cities.
Let them know.
Do you happen to know a woman named Anna Taborska?
I
Is
don't
a
think so.
wonderful, wonderful horror director, acclaimed horror director and author, and Bram Stoker award-winning author. She's also made, she's worked with the BBC, and even worked with people like Rutger Hauer. And she's one of the sweetest, nicest people that I know. A real
Uh-huh.
sweetheart. I think you and she would get along.
She sounds
So I'm
fabulous.
gonna kind of hook you up by email.
Okay, sounds good.
And so yeah, so is there anything else, or this was
Well,
so fun, so
I
much
I just
fun.
appreciate you having me on, and I'm so glad that you appreciated All About Evil so much. It always tickles me when people still enjoy it. It just screened, last week at the Roxy, and I got to go and
Wow.
introduce it. And before that, it screened a couple weeks ago in Normal, Illinois, of all places. So it's just
Wow.
lovely that it's still finding new audiences. So,
Yes,
thanks for having me on. And if your
absolutely.
listeners want to listen to more of my obnoxious voice, my Midnight Mass podcast is all about my love of cult movies. I
Yeah.
do it with my friend Michael Verratti. So yeah, check us out.
Okay, cool. And a big warm squeeze and hugs to you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Candy. Good to
Thank
meet
you.
you.
Thank
All
you,
right.
Joshua. Take care.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.